So we will get started here. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending our first product update webinar, where we'll be going through our new likely to sell indicator and how we can uncover opportunities with the new likely to sell feature. Also just wanted to mention that we will be sending a recording of this whole webinar after we end today, and we'll be sending over a survey to see how everything went. So I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Catherine Connor. I work in customer marketing here at Reonomy, and I'm joined today by Rachel, who's on our product team.
Hi everyone, my name's Rachel Foray. As Catherine mentioned, I'm an associate product manager here at Reonomy, and I'm very excited to talk with you today.
All right, so to go over our agenda, we'll be walking you through the feature update. So we'll be doing an overview of the likely to sell indicator and what that means for you. Then Rachel will be walking us through an in-app demo. So we'll be finding some of those off-market opportunities within the Reonomy platform. And then we'll finish up with some Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout the course of the webinar, please chat those in via the Q&A functionality, and we'll get to those at the end, or we'll follow up with an email to answer any questions that we've missed. So the reason we're here today is because one of our most commonly asked questions is, how can I best target properties with a high likelihood to sell? So before I was in my current role, I was actually on our client success team here at Reonomy, and one of the most frequently asked questions that we receive on a daily basis from our users is, how can I find properties that are likely to sell, or how do I know if a property is ready to sell? The short answer is that we don't always know, and it's not a guarantee, but our team has worked to put together a data science model to answer some of those questions.
Exactly. So in the past, users would enter our platform, and we have over 50 million properties. And we know that approximately 5% will transact in a given year, but it's very difficult to pinpoint which properties those will be and to focus on the right properties. As you know, Reonomy is an off-market platform, so we don't have any listings. So it is in the platform, the users find that owner motivation and the properties that are most likely to sell. So previous to this update, we would often suggest for users that they could use our sales filter and filter specifically on properties that haven't sold in the last 10 years. And this was a good proxy, and oftentimes it did get our users close to what they were looking for, but it wasn't necessarily specific enough. Another item which we would suggest is using the mortgage maturity or origination date. So it's hard to know exactly when a property is going to sell, but this often coincides when the mortgage is coming due. So what we would suggest, if you select mortgage filters such as originated between 5 and 7 years ago, or that due date is coming soon on the mortgage within, say, the next year, these would be a really good place to start. But it really is a place to start, and we think that we could do better than this, and that's where the likely to sell indicator comes into play. So what we did, as Catherine mentioned, we took a data science approach to create an indicator that could be used as a filter, but would also appear on properties. And this indicator would be in a place that it would point out properties that are most likely to transact within the next 2 years. And one thing you'll notice within our demo in a bit is we have a separation with the indicator where we indicate some properties as high likelihood to sell and other properties as medium likelihood to sell. And I'll get into that a bit more. So one of the biggest questions around the likely to sell indicator is, how are you coming up with this? Obviously, it sounds exciting, but it's difficult to trust in some ways. So I want to tell you a little bit more about the methodology of what goes into this model. So our data science team analyzed historical data over the past couple decades, and they found patterns and different attributes that could go into a likely to sell model. So some of the different things that were considered, one was sale transaction and history. And when you think of the last sale date or last mortgage date, items like this would go into the history of a property. We'd also look at patterns. So for instance, some properties might sell every 7 years, and there seems to be a pattern that we're seeing there. We're also going to look at historical market level trends. So you can think of this at the local level for a certain zip code or neighborhood, but you can also think of it at a higher market level. So in a certain MSA. So that's comparing similar properties of the same asset category to each other, looking at trends. For instance, you might think of a popular neighborhood such as Williamsburg in Brooklyn, and in recent years you would see increased transaction history and a property simply being in that neighborhood of a certain asset category could make it more likely to sell. Also, we look at the property's attributes at the current point in time. So we're looking at the tax information and the value of the property, the size of the property, and comparing that to other properties to try to get indication and value, and putting all of these things together to essentially weight properties against each other. And then what we can do with that is determine those properties that we think are most likely to transact in the coming years.
So as Rachel mentioned, you'll see the likelihood to sell score on some of our property cards and from your search results. So you'll find that the properties may have a medium or high likelihood to sell. So what does this all mean for you? Reonomy is an off-market opportunity platform, and we cover over 52 million commercial properties, which can definitely be overwhelming. So a lot of our sales brokers and investors have asked us, as we mentioned throughout the years, how can we find those properties that are likely to sell, and then what do we do with them? So when you're prospecting using Reonomy, likely to sell is going to help you to streamline your search using the indicator and allow you to focus on those properties that have that higher likelihood of selling in the next 2 years. When you're doing your outreach, you can prioritize based on that score that you're seeing. You're able to actually go in and sort the properties that you've searched by through the likelihood to sell score. And then in your deal making process, you're able to not only get in touch with those owners who are likely ready to sell, but you can then relationship build and build up your off-market pipeline with those medium likely to sell score properties as well. Now I'm going to hand it back over to Rachel, and she's going to walk us through an in-app demo of the likely to sell indicator.
Thanks, Catherine. So you can see I'm here in the Reonomy platform. And first, I'm going to perform a search without yet selecting the likely to sell filter. So today I am going to go right to Austin, Texas. And let's pretend I'm looking for a multifamily property. So I'm going to select multifamily, and maybe I'm looking for something that is at least 10 units, let's say, and then a maximum of 50 units. I'm going to apply those filters. And here you can see in my search, without even selecting the likely to sell filter, I'm seeing properties that have this indication within my list view. So I have 388 properties, and maybe I'm going to contact all of these owners, maybe only some of them, but to get started, it might be best to start with those properties with the highest likelihood to sell. So what I could do here is go right into my sort criteria, and I'm going to sort likely to sell from high to low. And now you can see that those properties with the highest likelihood to sell are appearing at the top of my list. And then, for instance, if I wanted to look at a property in detail, I could go into this view, and I'm still seeing the likely to sell indicator, regardless of whether I'm in that list view or if I'm looking at a property in detail. So this is clickable, and if you click it, we just give you a little bit more information and do link to a blog post that has some additional detail on likely to sell. So now going back to my search, if I really wanted to limit my properties to only those properties with the highest likelihood to sell, what I could do is I could go into my filters and go over to the sales tab, and then we have this likely to sell filter, and I would update it from no preference to yes. So what this is doing, this is now narrowing my search even more, and I'm going down, now I only have 301 results. And one thing I want to note is you can absolutely use that likely to sell feature in conjunction with other filters. So say I use that, and then I also, once property has not sold in the last 5 years, I could still add in that filter so I get an even more narrow search. So I would recommend using the likely to sell filter in conjunction with some of those other filters that you're already using and getting value from.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rachel. I also wanted to mention that, of course, 52 million commercial properties can be overwhelming. So this isn't necessarily a guarantee that this property is likely to sell, but it's really for you to be able to direct your search and add to those search filters to really get you closer to that list of prospects that you want to be outreaching to. All right, so now we'll open it up for some questions. Please chat into the Q&A function if you have anything to ask. And if we don't get to your question right now, we'll definitely be following up with you via email.
Awesome. And one question I want to address, Tyler, I see your question here. You asked, can you filter by only high likelihood to sell? So right now, that isn't an option. It's simply filtering just on those high and medium or no preference. However, if you want to focus on those highest likelihood properties to sell, what I would recommend is filter your search on likely to sell and then use that sorting option where you're going from highest to lowest. And then you could start with those properties that are most likely to sell.
Thanks, Rachel. I see we have another question here from Ben. What determines the likelihood to sell label?
Yep, so that's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, we are using a data science model approach, and I can give a little bit more background information into that approach. So that model includes several of those attributes I mentioned that are focusing on the historic trends, on a location and asset category, as well as trends specific to that property with transactions, as well as what does that property look like right now. So all of that information is combined, and through that, we're assigning a likely to sell score for a given property. And then from those scores, we've looked at distributions, and we have different thresholds for every single asset category. So we're specifically comparing a property to similar properties in that same asset category in that same location, and that would determine the score. And then if a score reaches a certain level, we would indicate that property as likely to sell. And then we have another cutoff which distinguishes those medium properties from the highest likelihood to sell properties.
Thanks, Rachel. It looks like we have another question here about prioritizing your outreach based on likely to sell and the indicator. So yes, that's definitely our recommendation. As Rachel mentioned, the factors of, the trends in the area, the intrinsic property data itself has led us to believe that the property will be likely to sell in the next 2 years. And we recommend sorting by the likelihood to sell score and prioritizing your outreach that way.
Awesome. I see a question here from Paul regarding no low ranking, and you're asking, is it assumed that if it drops off, it is low? Yes, that's correct. So we don't have a low likelihood to sell if it's below a certain threshold, it simply would have no likely to sell indicator, and you just wouldn't see that within the application. We do regularly run this model to account for any updates in transactions or any changes that might happen on the property. So from time to time, you will see properties who might have been a certain likelihood to sell. They might go into that no longer likelihood to sell category, or vice versa, where something was not indicated likely to sell, and then over time you'll see it go into a different area.
I see another question here from Kevin about seeing properties that are likely to sell that are already on the market or actively listed. So Reonomy is an off-market platform, so we don't have listings on our site. So we have accounted for that in the algorithm. You know, we are actively going to be taking properties off of the list when they are marked as likely to sell. If they have been transacted on, that will be updated in our system as soon as the transaction has gone through and been recorded.
Great. I see another question here. How many properties have you identified as likely to sell? So that's a great question. Right now, we've identified a little over 11 million properties as likely to sell. And I want to give some background information into how we tried to find accuracy as well as coverage. So it's hard to predict those properties which are likely to sell, but we think that this model gets us quite close. And one thing that we wanted to focus on was having sufficient coverage. We know that our Reonomy users are all over the United States and interested in many different asset categories. So we wanted to ensure that we were identifying those properties in all markets and all asset categories. So through that, there is no guarantee that a property identified as likely to sell will transact, but it is a great place to start. And from our testing, the properties which do transact are oftentimes within our label. So we do think that we are finding that balance of finding both good coverage, but also having precision.
I see another question here about Reonomy customers and being able to take advantage of the new feature. So all of our Reonomy subscription tiers will have access to the likely to sell filter. So as you saw in Rachel's demo today, you're able to go into your search filters and go over to the sales tab, and then you can search by likely to sell. And then when you're in your search list, you can also sort by likely to sell. I see another question about a recording as well. So we will be following up to everyone that registered for today's webinar with a recording, so you will be able to refer back to this. Any other questions, you can chat into the Q&A feature.
Yep, I do see a question around occupancy rate. So right now, Reonomy does not have leasing data or occupancy rates for our property. So that's not something we provide at this time. It's something we could consider in the future, but not right now.
And I see someone asking here about when this feature went live. So it went live about 2 weeks ago in our application. All right, I think we are about ready to wrap up. If we missed any of your questions today, we'll be sure to reply to you directly via email. So we'll be sending out a recording, as I mentioned, directly to your email. You'll be able to access this webinar whenever you'd like. We'll also be sending out an in-app or email survey to you so that you can give us any feedback on the topic that we covered today and the feature itself. We'd love to hear from you. And if you have any other additional questions that you can think of throughout the day, please reach out to us at support@reonomy.com.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.